Hi, everybody. As promised, I've got a Christmas story for you. I may have to do it in two installments. But anyway, if you're interested, I think you might like this story. It's by George Macdonald. It's entitled The Gift of the Child Christ. I'm going to summarize parts of it because it's rather long and I don't want to take too much time reading the whole thing. So it's a Christmas story set in Victorian England. It's about a family that's slowly drifting apart. The members of their family are the father, his name is Augustus Greatorex. I'm not sure if Macdonald is trying to say something with that last name, Greatorex, great or king. He's a great merchant of the city. And then his wife, Letty. This is his young, pretty, slightly vain second wife. His first wife died. And then third important character in the story is Augustus's 5-year-old neglected daughter from his first marriage. Her name is Sophie, but she has trouble pronouncing Sophie, so she pronounces her name Fosie. The story opens with the family in a church, and we start. "My hearers, we grow old," said the preacher. "Be it summer or be it spring with us now, autumn will soon settle down into winter, that winter whose snow melts only in the grave. The wind of the world sets for the tomb. Some of us rejoice to be swept along on its swift wings, and hear it bellowing in the hollows of the earth and sky. But it will grow a terror to the man of trembling limb and withered brain, until at length he will long for the shelter of the tomb to escape its roaring and buffeting. Happy the man who shall then be able to believe that old age itself, with its pitiable decays and sad dreams of youth, is the chastening of the Lord, a sure sign of his love and his fatherhood." So this takes place in early December. And Fosie becomes struck by the phrase being chastened by the Lord. She doesn't really know what it means, but she becomes somewhat fascinated and focused on it. Anyway, to summarize a little bit, after hearing the sermon, and the family hears it rather listlessly, rather with no inspiration, the family walks home, and each of the three members of the family goes to his or her own room. A little focus on Fosie now. Little Sophie, or as she called herself by a transposition of consonant sounds common with children, Fosie, found her nurse Alice in the nursery. But Alice was lost in the pages of a certain London weekly, which had found her in a mood open to its influences, and did not even look up when the child entered. With some effort, Fosie drew off her gloves, and with more difficulty untied her hat. Then she took off her jacket, smoothed her hair, and retreated into a corner. There a large, shabby doll lay upon her little chair. She took it up, disposed it gently upon the bed, seated herself in its place, got a little book from where she had left it under the chair, smoothed down her skirts, and began simultaneously to read and suck her thumb. The book was an unhealthy one, a cup filled to the brim with a poverty-stricken and selfish religion. Such are always breaking out like an eruption here and there over the body of the church, doing their part, doubtless, in carrying off the evil humors generated by poverty of blood or the congestion of self-preservation. It is wonderful out of what spoiled fruit some children will suck sweetness. But Fosie did not read far. Her thoughts went back to a phrase which had haunted her ever since first she went to church. And the phrase that haunts her is, "Whom the Lord loveth, he chasteneth." I wish he would chasten me, she thought for the 100th time. The small Christian had no suspicion that her whole life had been a period of chastening, that few children indeed had to live in such a sunless atmosphere as hers. Again, to summarize a little bit of the story, we learned a little about Alice. Alice is not very concerned with Fosie. She's not cruel, but she basically neglects her and doesn't spend much time with her. Then we learn a little bit more about Mr. Greatorex. We read, Mr. Greatorex was a merchant in the city, but he was more of a man than a merchant, which all merchants are not. Also, he was more scrupulous in his dealings than some merchants in the same line of business, who yet stood as well with the world as he. But on the other hand, he had the meanness to pride himself upon it, as if it had been something he might have done without, and yet held up his head. Some 6 years before, he had married to please his parents, and a year before, he had married to please himself. His first wife had intellect, education, and heart, but little individuality, not enough to reflect the individuality of her husband. The consequence was he found her uninteresting. He was kind and indulgent, however, and not even her best friend blamed him much for manifesting nothing beyond the average devotion of husbands. But in truth, his wife had great capabilities, only they never ripened. And when she died, a fortnight after giving birth to Sophie, her husband had not a suspicion of the large amount of undeveloped power that had passed away with her. Her child was so like her both in countenance and manner that he, too, was constantly reminded of her unlamented mother. And he loved neither enough to discover that, in a sense as true as marvelous, the child was the very flower bud of her mother's nature, in which her retarded blossom had yet a chance of being slowly carried to perfection. Love alone gives insight, and the father took her merely for a miniature edition of the volume which he seemed to have laid aside forever in the dust of the earth's lumber room. Instead, therefore, of watering the roots of his little human slip from the well of his affections, he had scarcely as yet perceived more in relation to her than that he was legally accountable for her existence and bound to give her shelter and food. If he had questioned himself on the matter, he would have replied that love was not wanting, only waiting upon her growth and the development of something to interest him. Then we learn about why he decided to marry a second time. And his primary motive for marrying a second time was to try to mold a younger woman into the kind of wife that he wanted. We read, in his suit he had prospered perhaps too easily. He loved the girl, or at least loved the modified reflection of her in his own mind, while she, thoroughly admiring the dignity, good looks, and accomplishments of the man whose attention flattered her self-opinion, accorded him deference enough to encourage his vainest hopes. Although she knew little, fluttering over the merest surfaces of existence, she had sense enough to know that he talked sense to her, and foolishness enough to put it down to her own credit, while for the sense itself she cared little or nothing. And Greatorex, without even knowing what she was rough-hewn for, would take upon him to shape her ends, an ambition the divinity never permits to succeed. He who fancies himself the carver finds himself but the chisel, or indeed perhaps only the mallet in the hand of the true workman. Well, to summarize, soon after the marriage, he discovers that she was too shallow to be molded, at least the way he wanted to mold her. He tries to interest her in economics. He tries to interest her in the poetry of Milton and of Spenser. But she is only interested in romantic novels and clothing catalogs. So not long after, both he and she resolved to have a quiet but uninspired and uncommunicative marriage. She does, however, get pregnant. Back to Fosie. All this time, poor little Fosy was left to the care of Alice. That's her maid. A clever, careless, good-hearted, self-satisfied damsel who, although seldom so rough in her behavior as we have just seen, abandoned the child almost entirely to her own resources. It was often she sat alone in the nursery, wishing the Lord would chasten her, because then he would love her. Again, you can see how this phrase of wanting to be chastened comes back time and time again. During a dinner conversation showing the separateness and the isolation of Greater Rex and his wife Letty, she suggests that they go to a dinner party, but Mr. Greater Rex is not interested at all. Fosy, during this dinner, sat in a corner, listened, and understood. Or where she misunderstood, it was an honest misunderstanding, which never does much hurt. Neither father nor mother spoke to her till they bade her good night. Neither saw the hungry heart under the mask of the still face. The father never imagined her already fit for the modeling she was better without, and the stepmother had to become a mother before she could value her. Fosy went to bed to dream of the valley of humiliation. Now I'm skipping some more part of the story. I'm going to skip ahead to Christmas time. Mr. Greatorex had ceased to regard the advent of Christmas with much interest. Naturally gifted with a strong religious tendency, he had, since his first marriage, taken not to denial, but to the side of objection, spending much energy and contempt for the foolish opinions of others, a self-indulgence which does less than little to further the growth of one's own spirit in truth and righteousness. The only person who stands excused, I do not say justified, in so doing is the man who, having been taught the same opinions, has found them a legion of adversaries, barring his way to the truth. But having got rid of them for himself, it is, I suspect, worse than useless to attack them again, save as the ally of those who are fighting their way through the same ranks to the truth. Greatorex had been indulging his intellect at the expense of his heart. A man may have light in the brain and darkness in his heart. It were better to be an owl than a strong-eyed kiwi. He was on the path which naturally ends in blindness and unbelief. I fancy, this is the narrator speaking, I fancy if he had not been neglectful of his child, she would ere this time have relighted his Christmas candles for him. But now his second disappointment in marriage had so dulled his heart that he had begun to regard life as a stupid affair, in which the most enviable fool was the man who could still expect to realize an ideal. He had set out on a false track altogether, but had not yet discovered that there had been an immoral element at work in his mistake. That year Christmas Eve fell on a Monday. The day before, Letty, not feeling very well, her husband thought it better not to leave her and gave up going to church. Fosy was utterly forgotten, but she dressed herself and at the usual hour appeared with her prayer book in her hand ready for church. When her father told her that he was not going, she looked so blank that he took pity upon her and accompanied her to the church door, promising to meet her as she came out. Fosy sighed from relief as she entered, for she had a vague idea that by going to church to pray for it, she might move the Lord to chasten her. At least he would see her there and might think of it. She had never had such an attention from her father before, never such dignity conferred upon her as to be allowed to appear in church alone, sitting in the pew by herself, like a grown damsel. The preacher was one of whom she had never heard her father speak a slighting word, in whom her unbounded trust had never been shaken. Also, he was one who believed with his whole soul in the things that make Christmas precious. To him, the birth of the wonderful baby hinted at hundreds of strange things in the economy of the planet. that a man could so thoroughly persuade himself that he believed the old fable was a matter of marvel to some of his friends who held blind nature the eternal mother, and nature the everlasting grandmother of all things. But the child Phoebe, in her dreams or out of them, in church or nursery, with her book or her doll, was never out of the region of wonders, and would have believed or tried to believe anything that did not involve a moral impossibility. What the preacher said, I need not even partially repeat. It is enough to mention a certain metamorphized deposit from the stream of his eloquence carried home in her mind by Phoebe. From some of his sayings about the birth of Jesus in the world into the family, into the individual human bosom, Phoebe got into her head that Christmas Day was not a birthday like that she herself had last year, but that in some wonderful way, to her requiring no explanation, the baby Jesus was born every Christmas Day afresh. What became of him afterwards she did not know, and indeed she had never yet thought to ask how it was that he could come to every house in London as well as number 1 Wimborne Square, where she lived. Her father had forgotten that Phoebe was at church, but so entranced was her heart with the expectation of the promised visit, now so near, the day after tomorrow, that if she did not altogether forget to look for him as she stepped down the chair from the church door to the street, his absence caused her no uneasiness. And when she reached it, he opened the house door in tardy haste to redeem his promise. She looked up at him with a solemn, smileless repose, born of spiritual tension and speechless anticipation upon her face, and walking past him without changing the rhythm of her motion, marched stately up the stairs to the nursery. I believe the center of her hope was that when the baby Jesus came, she would beg him on her knees to ask the Lord to chasten her. On Christmas Eve, the church bells were ringing through the murky air of London, whose streets lay flaring and streaming below. The brightest of their constellations were the butchers' shops with their shows of prize beef. Around them the eddies of human tides were most confused and knotted. But the toy shops were brilliant also. To Phoebe they would have been the treasure caves of the child Christ, all mysteries, all with insides to them, boxes and desks and windmills and dovecotes, and hens with chickens, and who could tell what all? In every one of those shops her eyes would have searched for the Christ child, the giver of all their wealth. For to her he was everywhere that night, ubiquitous as the luminous mist that brooded over all of London. And she falls asleep. Now during the night, Letty has a problem. Remember, she's pregnant. It had been a troubled fortnight with Mrs. Greatorex. She wished much that she could have talked to her husband more freely, but she had not learned to feel at home with him. Yet he had been kinder and more attentive than usual all the time, so much so that Letty thought with herself, if she gave him a boy, he would certainly return to his first devotion. She said boy because anyone might see that he cared little for Phoebe. She had never discovered that he was disappointed in herself, but since her disregard of his wishes had brought evil upon her, she had begun to suspect that he had some ground for being dissatisfied with her. She never dreamed of his kindness as the effort of a conscientious nature to make the best of what could not now be otherwise helped. Her own poverty of spirit and lack of worth achieved she knew as little of as she did the riches of Michael the Archangel. One must have begun to gather wisdom before he can see his own folly. And then skipping ahead a little bit. It was the morning of Christmas Day, and little Phoebe knew it in every cranny of her soul. She was not of those who had been up all night, and now she was awake early and wide, and the moment she awoke she was speculating, he was coming today. How would he come? Where should she find the baby Jesus? And when would he come? In the morning? Or in the afternoon? Or in the evening? She crept out of her room and down the stair. The house was very still. What if Jesus should come and find nobody awake? Would he go again and leave them no presents? She couldn't expect any presents herself, but might he not let her take theirs for the rest? Perhaps she ought to wake them all, but she dared not without being sure. On the last landing above the first stair, she saw, by the low gaslight at the end of the corridor, an unknown figure pass the foot of the stair. Could she have anything to do with the marvel of the day? The woman looked up, and Fosey dropped the question. When she reached the bottom of the stair, she saw the woman disappearing in her stepmother's room. That she did not like. It was the one room into which she could not go. But as the house was so still, she would search everywhere else, and if she did not find the baby Jesus, would then sit down in the hall and wait for him. The room next to the foot of the stairs and opposite her stepmother's was the spare room, with which she associated ideas of state and grandeur. Where better could she begin than at the guest chamber? There, could it be? Yes. Through the chink of the scarce closed door she saw light. Either Jesus was already there, or there they were expecting him. From that moment she felt as if lifted out of the body. Far exalted above all dread, she peeped modestly in and then entered. Beyond the foot of the bed a candle stood on a little low table, but nobody was to be seen. There was a stool near the table. She would sit on it by the candle and wait for him. But ere she reached it, she caught sight of something upon the bed that drew her thither. She stood entranced. Could it be? It might be. Perhaps he had left it there while he went into her mamma's room with something for her. She saw the loveliest of dolls she ever imagined. She drew nearer. The light was low and the shadows were many. She could not be sure what it was, but when she had gone up close to it, she concluded with certainty that it was in very truth a doll, perhaps intended for her, but beyond doubt the most exquisite of dolls. She dragged a chair to the bed, got up, pushed her little arms softly under it, and drawing it gently to her, slid down with it. When she felt her feet firm on the floor, filled with the solemn composure of all, she carried away the gift of the child Jesus to the candle, that she might better admire the beauty and know its preciousness. But the light had no sooner fallen upon it than a strange, undefinable doubt awoke within her. Whatever it was the very essence of loveliness. The tiny darling with its alabaster face and its delicately modeled hands and fingers. A long nightgown covered the rest. Was it possible? Could it be? Yes, indeed, it must be. It could be nothing else than a real baby. What a goose she had been. Of course, it was the baby Jesus himself. For was this not his own Christmas Day on which he was always born? If she had felt awe of his gift before, what a grandeur of adoring love, what a divine dignity possessed her, holding in her arms the very child himself. One shudder of bliss passed through her, and in an agony of possession she clasped the baby to her great heart. Then at once became still with the satisfaction of eternity, with the peace of God. She sat down on the stool near the little table with her back to the candle, that its rays should not fall on the eyes of the sleeping Jesus and wake him. There she sat, lost in the very majesty of bliss, at once the mother and the slave of the Lord Jesus. But as she did so, again a sudden doubt invaded her. Jesus lay so very still, never moved, never opened his pale eyelids. And now set to thinking, she noted that he did not breathe. She had seen babies asleep, and their breath came and went. Their little bosoms heaved up and down, and sometimes they would smile, and sometimes they would moan and sigh. But Jesus did none of all these things. Was it not strange? And then he was cold, oh, so cold. A blue silk coverlet lay on the bed. She half rose and dragged it off and contrived to wind it around herself and the baby. Sad at heart, very sad but undismayed, she sat and watched her on her lap. Now, her father discovers Fosie there, and of course, the truth is that Fosie has found her stillborn brother. Again, she's mistaken it for the baby Jesus. Her father. He stepped forward and saw Fosie half shrouded in blue, the candle behind illuminating the hair she had found too rebellious to brush, and making of it a faint aureole about her head and white face, whence cold and sorrow had driven all the flush, rendering it colorless as that upon her arm, which had never seen the light. She had pored on the little face until she knew death, and now she sat a speechless mother of sorrow, bending the dim light of the tomb over the body of her holy infant. How it was, I cannot tell, but the moment her father saw her, she looked up, and the spell of her dumbness broke. Jesus is dead, she said, slowly and sadly, but with perfect calmness. He is dead, she repeated. He came too early, and there was no one to take care of him, and he's dead, dead, dead. But as she spoke the last words, the frozen lump of agony gave way. The well of her heart suddenly filled, swelled, overflowed. The last word was half a sob, half a shriek of utter despair and loss. Alice darted forward and took the dead baby tenderly from her. The same moment her father raised the little mother and clasped her to his bosom. Her arms went around his neck. Her head sank on his shoulder, and sobbing in grievous misery, yet already a little comforted, he bore her from the room. No, no, Fosie, said her father. Jesus is not dead. Thank God. It's only your little brother who hadn't life enough and has gone back to God for more. So I think that at this point in the story, Macdonald is suggesting that through this crisis, through this tragedy, God's love becomes real for everyone in this family. And through the chastening of the family through this dead baby, the whole family is in the end reconciled. And so we come to the end of the story. When Mr. Greatorex returned to his wife's room and thought to find her asleep as he had left her, she was dismayed to hear sounds of soft weeping from the bed. Some tone or stray word never intended to reach her ear had been enough to reveal the truth concerning her baby. Hush, hush, he said, with more love in his heart than had moved there for many months, and therefore more in his tone than she had heard, and therefore more in his tone than she had heart for, as many. If you cry, you will be ill. Hush, my dear. In a moment, ere he could prevent her, she had flung her arms around his neck, and he stopped, and he stooped over her. Husband, husband, she cried, is it my fault? You behaved perfectly, he returned. No woman could have been braver. Ah, but I wouldn't stay at home when you wanted me. Never mind that now, my child. At the word, she pulled his face down to hers. I have you, and I don't care, he added. Do you care to have me? His wife said with a sob that ended in a loud cry. Oh, I don't deserve it, but I will be good after this. I promise you I will. Then you must begin now, my darling. You must lie perfectly still and not cry a bit, or you will go after the baby and I shall be left alone. She looked at him with such a light in her face as he had never dreamed of there before. He had never seen her so lovely. Then she withdrew her arms, repressed her tears, smiled, and turned her face away. He put her hands under the clothes, and in a minute or two she was again fast asleep. That day, when Fosie and her father had sat down to their Christmas dinner, he rose again, and taking her up as she sat, chair and all, set her down close to him on the other side of the corner of the table. It was the first of a new covenant between them. The father's eyes having been suddenly opened to her character and preciousness, as well as to his own neglected duty in regards to her, it was as if a well of life had burst forth at his feet. And every day as he looked in her face and talked to her, it was with more and more respect for what he found in her, with growing tenderness for her predilections, and reverence for the divine idea enclosed in her ignorance, for her childish wisdom and her calm seeking, until at length he would have been horrified at the thought of training her up in his way. Had she not a way of her own to go, following not the dead Jesus, but him who liveth forever? In the endeavor to help her, he had to find his own position towards the truth, and the results were weighty. Nor did the child's influence work forward merely. In his intercourse with her, he was often so reminded of his first wife that with the gloss or comment of a childish reproduction, that his memories of her at length grew a little tender, and through the child he began to understand the nature and worth of the mother. In her child she had given him what she could not be herself. Unable to keep up with him, she had handed him her baby and dropped on the path. Nor was little Sophie his only comfort. Through their common loss and her husband's tenderness, Letty began to grow a woman, and her growth was the more rapid that, himself taught through Fosie, her husband no longer desired to make her adopt his tastes and judge with his experiences, but as became the elder and the tried, entered into her taste and experiences, became as it were a child again with her, that, through the thing she was, he might help the thing she had to be. As soon as she was able to bear it, he told her the story of the dead Jesus, and with the tale came to her heart a love for Fosie. She had lost a son for a season, but she had gained a daughter forever. Such were the gifts of the Christ child brought to one household that Christmas, and the days of the mourning of that household were ended. I've always loved this story. I think it's lovely, it's tender, it's tragic, and I think Macdonald catches something about the magic and the mystery of Christmas Day and of Christ coming. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it.